In the late 1930s, as it seemed that another war was on the horizon, the Admiralty of the United Kingdom began to realize that if a war did indeed break out, that they would not have enough escorts for their convoys. As in the interwar period, doctrine called for destroyers to fulfill this role, but as destroyers were needed elsewhere for duties in the fleet, it seemed that the Royal Navy would have to look elsewhere for their escort ships. These ships would need to be able to deal with submarines in some capacity, along with keeping up with the merchant ships of the convoy, and be able to be built very quickly and relatively inexpensively. It's important to note that the Admiralty looked at a whale catcher/trawler design in 1936, but did not follow through with it. Then, as February 1939 came around, and war seemed very near, the Admiralty would consider the idea once again, and 6 options were put forward. The first being converted trawlers of 620 tons, 11 to 12 knots, and costing £3,500 in 4 weeks for conversion. The second being a commercial trawler, built to Admiralty specifications, 510 tons, 12 knots, and costing £57,500, each taking 6 months to build. Third, Smith's Dock Southern Type Pride whaler, 700 tons, 16 knots, and costing £75,000 and 7 months to build. Fourth, a whaler built to Admiralty specifications, 700 tons, 16 knots, and costing £90,000 and 7 months to build. Fifth, 1939 minesweeping design, 17 knots, costing £135,000 and taking 8 months to build. Finally, a simplified Guillemot design coastal sloop, 580 tons, 20 to 21 knots, costing £160,000 and 8 months to build. The Admiralty would talk to representatives from Smith's Dock, which were specialists in trawler-sized vessels, and builders of the Southern Pride type, which would eventually be the starting point of the Flower class. Smith's Dock had never built a warship, but, as I mentioned, were very good at building trawler-sized vessels, so essentially whaling or fishing boats. By April the 13th of 1939, the Admiralty had taken the decision to proceed with Smith's Dock whaler and future anti-submarine patrol vessel design, where obvious changes would need to be made to fit the needs of the Navy. Early on, the specifications of the ship would be as follows. With a standard displacement of around 940 tons and just under 1,200 tons full load. They would have 2 Scotch boilers that would power a single triple expansion engine, producing around 2,750 shaft horsepower, giving the ship a top speed of 16 knots. They would be armed with a single 4-inch gun, some 50 caliber machine guns, and some smaller caliber Lewis machine guns. It would also carry a pair of depth charge launchers and 2 depth charge rails, with between 25 to 40 depth charges on board. The ships would also carry some very basic sonar and radar equipment. As the war went on, the ships would be modified even more, with some more anti-aircraft and anti-submarine warfare equipment being added on. 296 ships of this class would be built, while 36 would be destroyed in the course of the war. Before we continue on with the ship's general activities in the war, it's important to discuss the ship's designation as a corvette. This designation has nothing to do with the previous one used to describe small warships in earlier periods. The term sloop was being used to describe a lot of small vessels in the Royal Navy, so they needed an intermediate designation of something smaller than a destroyer, but bigger than a sloop, so they used the term corvette. As other ships that were larger than a corvette and smaller than a destroyer came along, they used the term frigate. Now, the ships would serve in a number of navies during the war, with the Royal Canadian Navy, Royal Navy, Royal New Zealand Navy, Royal Norwegian Navy, Royal Yugoslav Navy, South African Navy, Royal Netherlands Navy, Royal Indian Navy, Royal Hellenic Navy, Free Belgian Navy, Marine Nationale, and the United States Navy, as well as the Kriegsmarine. As some of the class were being built in France as the nation fell to the invading German forces, they would fall into the hands of the German occupiers and be used as patrol craft, which is quite interesting, having the same class of ships serving on both sides of the war. Please let me know of any other ship classes that would serve in both Axis and Allied navies down in the comments. Now, while service in the Royal Navy, being the flower class, they would be named after flowers like azalea, hibiscus, honeysuckle, and petunia. Now, while in the United States Navy, the ships would be called the Action class, with some pretty cool names like Fury, Restless, Saucy, a personal favorite of mine, and Tenacity. The most notable place that the flower class would see service would be in the Battle of the Atlantic, as well as in other theaters of the war like the Mediterranean. In the Battle of the Atlantic, the main opponent of the Flower class would be the German U-boat. Now, if a U-boat was surfaced and spotted, the Flower class would usually charge the surfaced U-boat and attempt to make it to dive, so that its speed and maneuverability would be reduced, and then they would take it under depth charge attack, to either sink it or to keep it preoccupied so that the convoy wasn't attacked. The Corvette captains would also have to take in consideration how far they chased the U-boat. As I mentioned, they weren't exactly the fastest ships, and would have to keep up with the convoy, so the Flowers would mainly focus on keeping the U-boats away from the merchant vessels. While in the Atlantic, as for most other sailors serving in this theater, things were usually pretty wet and cold, but especially so on the Flower class, as ships would tend to take on a lot of water on the bow as the ships would go through the ocean, along with being generally pretty cramped ships to live on. Later Flower class corvettes would see modifications to the size of the ship to accommodate this. Being based off of the trawler design, it meant that the ships were pretty adept at traveling at sea, but had a tendency to roll quite violently, although not actually capsizing. The ships would be fairly successful at hunting down and sinking Axis submarines, hoping to sink at least 51 of them. As the war would continue, each of the Flower class would be fairly unique, as each ship would have individual adaptations like additional radar and sonar, along with changes to the mess galley to just name a few. The Flower class's construction would be ceased near the end of the war, followed by the larger River-class frigates and improved Castle-class corvettes. I hope you've enjoyed this somewhat shorter video on the Flower class. They are an interesting little class of ships, and I had wanted to do a video on them since starting this channel. Please remember to like and subscribe.